anthropologist who has come across some of the articles I've written on it, and if you know how those people are, they get to be, into great detail. But I was explaining to him that I don't talk about my Union ancestor to the southern side of my family. My Union ancestor began his service when he joined Sherman's army in Atlanta and participated in the infamous March to the Sea, which finished in Charleston after having ravaged the South. There's only one PowerPoint that's on there. Can you select that one? And I'm sorry I'm a little bit late and discombobulated. Yesterday was the first day of classes, and I've been bombarded with student questions over the past couple of days, including meeting with the student on a project that he's going to be working on this semester to catalog Maya objects in the Spooner Hall collection, which should make them accessible for student use and for study, as well as for loan and display. I also spent all of last week at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. Some of you may be familiar with this institution. It was the private estate of Robert Woods Bliss, who made his fortune in armaments during the First World War. And actually, I think he made money even before that, with some of the European wars. But he took his war bucks and invested them in a wonderful collection of pre-Columbian objects. Maya, Aztec, Olmec, South American objects. And all last week, I had the honor of working in the collections with objects of gold and jade. I'm a specialist in the archaeology of Costa Rica, and Dumbarton Oaks is preparing to put together a catalog of their materials from Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia, virtually all of which are either fine polished jade or objects that are made out of cast or hammered gold. So the real treasures of El Dorado are the ones that we were looking at last week. And what Professor Daly has asked me to talk about today is one of the many things that I'm interested in. I should mention I'm the only faculty member on the KU campus who specializes in the ancient civilizations of Central and South America. And I was pointing out to my students yesterday, I teach a class this semester that's called Ancient Mayas. And I pointed out to them yesterday in my introductory class that 100 years ago, there were some things that you were expected to know to graduate from high school, much less to enter college. And it was sort of taken for granted that every student on the KU campus would have had some exposure to this. And I said there were two languages that you were expected to know, that they don't hardly teach much anymore, and most students, very few students take them. And I said 100 years ago, you would have been expected to know Greek and Latin. You would have been expected to read the Odyssey in the original. You would have been expected to read Virgil, and you would have been expected to read the works of Catullus and Cicero and other materials in Greek and Latin. And I said, well, the reason for that was because the American democracy is based upon Roman democracy and on Greek philosophy. And this was part of what put this country's political system together. And you were simply expected to know the classics. Well, our classics department is now fairly small. Very few KU students graduate knowing either Greek or Latin, much less recognizing that as being a fundamental part of their heritage. But I made a prediction in my class yesterday, based on current demographics in the United States and based on current trends. I pointed out that last week, a very notable statistic in the state of California is that the category of, the ethnic category of Hispanics in California is now greater in number than the category of non-Hispanic whites. There are now more Hispanic whites in California than non-Hispanic whites. And it's happening across the country. Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Florida, New York, Michigan. The Hispanic population, the Latino population of the US is growing in leaps and bounds. And my prediction was that whereas 100 years ago you were expected to know Greek and Latin, in another generation people will be expected to know not the ancient history of Greece and Rome, but the ancient history of Central and South America, which will become ancient American history. We tend not to look at it that way. We're disassociated from those people south of the border because many of our ancestors came from Great Britain or Northern Europe, and they're just not our people. Well, that's shifting, and the history of America is suddenly becoming a lot deeper with the recognition of the indigenous roots, the Latin American roots of what is becoming American culture and will be continuing to be American culture around the globe. And so I really feel that understanding pre-Columbian cultures is a really critical part of understanding American civilization, especially as we project it forward a couple of generations. Something else to give one pause, I asked my students, I said, we take it for granted we speak English in the United States, but how many of you had grandparents or great-grandparents who spoke a language other than English? And many of them raised their hands and they said, oh, German, or Polish, Russian even. Others were Chinese. And I said, here's something to think about. Your great-grandparents or grandparents who spoke another language probably view your speaking English as a departure from their cultural tradition. I said, what do you want to guess that your great-grandchildren, or perhaps even your grandchildren, will grow up with something other than English as their first language? I said, in another generation or two, it could be Spanish, it could be Chinese, but these things shift and change. And my own perspective on human cultures is we really need to embrace them in all of their diversity. And we also need to get away from ideas that things are strange and mysterious. I was asked today to talk about some objects that are almost always considered to be mysterious. How many of you have heard of the giant stone spheres of Costa Rica? These are objects that are among the most unusual objects on the planet. They essentially are, I'll show you some pictures of them, they're just what they sound like. Great big balls. This is why I told Professor Daly, if I didn't have my PowerPoint, I would just kind of go like this. Because that's what they are. And there are over 300 of these that are known from Costa Rica. They range in size from about that big, depending on what you want to call a stone sphere. Some of them are even smaller. And the largest are over 2 meters in diameter, over 8 feet in diameter. And they are spherical. They are carved out of a material that's called gabbro, or granodiorite. And they are not natural objects. We know that they are stone sculptures. And what I wanted to do today was try to put these stone sculptures into context. In an area in which they're found, which is called Greater Chiriquí. The term comes from the Chiriquí province of western Panama, but it's an area that extends into southern Costa Rica, which is why it's called Greater Chiriquí, sort of like Greater Kansas City. Greater metropolitan Kansas City extends over into KCK. Greater Chiriquí crosses the Panamanian border into Costa Rica. If I can have the next slide, and actually I think for the slides, what I'll do is I'll kind of go like that or make some signal.
John, would you use the microphone?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Please, thank you.
You can take it off the stand if you want.
Well, maybe that'll help. I like to walk around a little bit. That'll work. And if you have any trouble understanding or have a question, just raise your hand. This is a map of the area in which the large stone spheres are found. It's an area, as I said, in the border area between Costa Rica and Panama. The Panama Canal would be right about here. And we're talking about western Panama, as well as the southeastern portion of Costa Rica. And the area in which the stone spheres are found is called the Diquis Delta, D-I-Q-U-I-S, which is where a large river called the Teraba Cotobruz River makes an elbow turn and then empties into the Pacific Ocean here. And in fact, this entire area is a deltaic region there's a main river channel, but there's several other rivers that come off of it. And this entire area is an area of swamps and mangrove swamps and sort of braided, what we might refer to as bayous if we were in Louisiana. And among the things that make this area so intriguing is that, if you know anything about deltas, they don't have a lot of stone. They don't have a lot of rock. And one of the things that makes these large stone spheres so enigmatic is that they're in an area where you don't have a lot of large outcroppings. They were moved and placed in that location. Next slide. Okay, next one. Among the characteristics, and again, it's a little bit bright in here for seeing some of these, but among the characteristics of Western Panama include a tradition of stone sculpture that includes these very enigmatic cylinders. And in fact, I should say we really don't know the use of many of these objects yet. These large stone pedestals or cylinders sometimes have sculpture on the top of them, and the common name for them is simply barriles, or barrels, because they look like barrels. And in fact, a colleague of mine, Ifigenia Quintanilla, who is receiving her PhD from the University of Barcelona, has suggested that it was these that actually gave the idea for the spheres. They started out with cylinders and then sort of worked their way up to spheres. But these objects were used probably to mark cemeteries and to mark high-status households. And unfortunately, very few of them have been found in archaeological contexts. They're typically found on the surfaces of archaeological sites and become moved into museums. There is more elaborate stone sculpture in Western Panama. Next slide. And actually here you can see some of the designs that are done on tops of these barriles. One of the common designs is sort of a crocodile-like or maybe a standing iguana. Has a long tail, claws up here, and a face with two big eyes right there. We actually can recognize this shape or this form as being one very similar to some of the painted pottery from Panama. Next slide. Others are much less distinct. And you can see the stone itself is pretty rough and pitted. This is characteristic of the volcanic stone that you find in Costa Rica, where most of the sources of stone are basalts and other lavas that are extruded from the volcanoes that are there. Next slide. Some of them are decorated with dots and spots. Next slide. Others are kind of more broken up and difficult to see. Next slide. By putting chalk on them, we can see petroglyphs, but as you can tell, it's kind of difficult to tell what these represent. Are they life forms? Are they plants? We don't really know. Next slide. Well, this deltaic area of Western Panama is one where archaeological research has been taking place since the 1930s. In the 1950s, there was an archaeological expedition from National Geographic that actually went in by helicopter to this area of Highland Cherokee and conducted excavations at a site whose name comes from these large stone objects. The name of the site is Barriles, named for these big stone barrels. And among the things that were found there and published in National Geographic magazine in the 1940s were these very dramatic stone sculptures, including representations of people wearing conical hats. Next slide. And statues that are sometimes referred to as the man-on-slave statue. We don't know that this is a slave standing below, but it's a big naked man carrying a smaller man on his shoulders. And the fellow on top is holding small trophy heads, decapitated heads in his hands, wearing a conical hat, and then hanging around his neck is a small pendant that may be a representation of a pendant done either in greenstones, like jade, or perhaps of gold. We also have other representations of these human statues from Barriles, and we think that these are representations of the high-status caciques or chiefs in the area. They probably were associated with the ceremonial area. Unfortunately, it has not been very well preserved. And the excavations that were done in the 1950s did not find something like a plaza or a dance floor that we could recognize that these might have been put around, but they do seem to be sort of people on parade or being carried or marching around, or perhaps representations of a dance. These Barriles statues are very characteristic of this area and may represent some of the individuals who commissioned and used these large stone spheres. They're not space aliens. They're not the Greys or the little green men. They are human beings. And this helps to remove some of the mystery of these large, unusual stone objects. Here you can see a little bit more closely the pendants that they're wearing around their necks. This one is kind of a double human pendant. And we think these may be representations of gold ornaments, which I'll show you later on, that are typical of this area. But among the things you can appreciate from these photographs is how difficult it is to interpret exactly what is meant and what is being represented here. This is actually this actually shows a little double-headed figure. That's why I put this picture in, although the quality is not very good. These are coming from publications that appeared back in the 1950s. And here you see some other examples of those. This one is a fragment of a larger sculpture. Next one. And here you see some other examples. Who were these people? Well, we don't know for sure. We think that they spoke a language that was in the Chibchan language family, C-H-I-B-C-H-A-N. The name Mayas comes from people who speak languages in the Mayan language family. And there are about 30 different Mayan languages. The Mayans didn't disappear. There are between 6 and 7 million today. In fact, as a good rule of thumb, there are about as many Mayan speakers living today as there are Jews in the state of Israel. There's a little bit more than 6 million. And among the things I like to point out is that the Jews have been the most successful tribal people on the planet in terms of regaining traditional territory and vigorously defending it, as well as reviving their ancient language and maintaining their ancient religion. Sadly, that hasn't happened in Western Panama. It hasn't even happened with the Mayas. Although something else I pointed out, and I'll just mention this as a footnote, one of the ideas my students were taken with yesterday, they had never even considered before. As I said, the Mayans are still here, just as the Jews are still here. There's a worldwide Jewish diaspora that happened after the collapse of Jewish civilization. There is also a worldwide Maya diaspora that has happened in the wake of the collapse of Maya civilization. However, we don't call them Mayas. What do we call them? Hispanics, Latinos, illegal aliens, Mexicans. Those are the terms that we use. But there are Mayas who are in Lawrence, Kansas. There are Mayas in Kansas City. There are Mayas in Colby, Kansas, probably making beds at the Motel 6. There are Mayas in Southern California who are responsible for picking your vegetables. There are also descendants of these people of Panama who are currently in the U.S. and who you may encounter. And I think it's worthwhile to think about the rise and fall of civilizations. We don't know very much about these people of ancient Panama. One of my tasks as an archaeologist is to try to reconstruct the stories of those people, hoping that someday, when my civilization is no more, some future archaeologist will be digging up my stuff and saying, yeah, once there was a great civilization in a place called Lawrence, Kansas. I think we need to think about those kinds of things. Next slide. Other excavations at Barriles turned up, in addition to these large human sculptures, large grinding stones known as metates. This is a monumental one from the site of Barriles. Next slide. And here you can see what it looks like. A great huge plank of stone supported by two human figures. And among the things that are most intriguing about the decoration of these objects in Greater Chiriquí is lots of representations of little heads. I pointed out how the guy who's on the shoulders is holding little trophy heads in his hands. There's a very good chance that these heads that decorate this right here also represent trophy heads. Head hunting, head taking, head display was probably a fairly important part of these cultures. And we actually have other representations of people holding heads. Well, you may think that that is barbaric and savage, but the reality is people were cutting off heads and showing that on the internet not all that long ago in Iraq. And in fact, thank goodness we didn't spread too many photos of Osama bin Laden after he was killed. But the display of corpses and the display of bodies is something that we still do. We just do it in different types of contexts. It shows power. It shows control. Next slide. There are also representations on these large metates. Here you can see the kind of a blow up what these figures on the large monumental one look like. Some of them actually are also wearing these little pendants around their neck. And this becomes significant later on when I show you the gold jewelry that comes from this area. Next slide. The pottery is ubiquitous. There's lots and lots and lots of pottery. It tends to be painted red with decorations in incised lines, and sometimes artwork representing life forms. In this case, some kind of a creature. Here's the head, and then it has little arms coming off on either side, and then things sort of coming out from its mouth, which we don't really completely understand. I'll show you some examples of gold frogs and other creatures that have things kind of coming out from their mouth. We don't know exactly what those mean. But we do know that they had a fairly sophisticated ceramic technology in addition to the stonework that they were doing. And these are some examples of some of the earliest ceramics associated with this stone sculpture that I'm showing you. It's the ceramic types and ceramic styles that help us recognize time periods. And the particular time period that these correspond to, because of radiocarbon dates that we find association with these ceramic styles, is roughly the same time period as the early height of Maya civilization. Roughly between about 200 and about 700 AD. That is a time period that corresponded roughly with the same time period as the fall of Rome, the rise of the Emperor Constantine, the First Council of Nicaea, and other stuff that was happening in medieval Europe in the early medieval period. Now, I had a student in my office this morning, we were discussing the ancient Maya, and I said, well, I don't know about you, but in the 7th century, my ancestors probably looked like something out of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. They were living in a wooden shack someplace, they were mucking around in the mud, their civilization was not especially highly developed, and they probably didn't have a whole lot in the way of stone sculpture because those beautiful things like Stonehenge were much, much older in places like Britain or Central Europe. But I think it's worth reflecting on what your ancestors probably were doing or how they were living in the 7th century and realize that during this period we have a flourishing of civilizations in Central America. Next slide. At the Rebus site, which is a site excavated by my colleague Jeffrey Quilter, currently the director of the Peabody Museum at Yale. Next slide. Excavations turned up evidence of a village. Now the Rebus site is located farther up the valley. It's actually located right here. And this is the delta region I'm talking about down here, but it's all part of one valley system. And the excavations at the Rebus site give us a sense of what it was that people were doing. They carved large boulders. This actually may be a map of the mountains carved on the top of a boulder. And they built enormous houses. Now, one of the reasons why the cultures of Greater Cherokee have gotten less attention than the Maya is because these backwards people who really had less sophisticated technology, and all of that is in quotation marks, built their houses out of sustainable, perishable materials. Okay? Now, we kind of come around to our thinking on things. We tend to identify those cultures as civilizations, as high civilizations, when they built buildings out of stone. Why? Because we build buildings out of stone, and they last. However, in the tropical rainforests of South America, the tropical rainforests of southern Central America, stone was not the best building material. And in fact, it took a lot of work to cut and move and haul that stone. In fact, among the things that are necessary for building those big stone buildings that the Egyptians did is you need slaves, and you need laborers. You need to treat people really crappy sometimes to get them to move.